Sometimes I wonder if everything would have been different if my dad hadn't died that spring morning. I was only 6, but the memory is etched in my mind, sharp and vivid, like it happened just yesterday. Sunday mornings were our special time. Dad always made pancakes, his self-proclaimed masterpieces, which he would flip and decorate into goofy faces that never failed to make me giggle. Mom would hum some cheerful tune, though I could not tell you now what it was, while setting the table. That morning, everything felt so normal, so perfect. Dad called out, "Lily, princess, come help your old man flip these masterpieces." He waved his spatula in the air like it was a magic wand, his grin as wide as ever. I remember leaping off the couch, leaving my beloved stuffed bunny in a crumpled heap behind me, and running to the kitchen. But then everything changed. The spatula hit the floor with a loud clatter as Dad suddenly clutched his chest, his face contorted in a way I had never seen before. Fear shot through me, but I was frozen, unable to understand what was happening. Everything after that moment blurred together. The wail of ambulance sirens, the bright, sterile lights of the hospital corridors, and the sound of my mother crying uncontrollably. Just like that, Dad was gone. The house, once alive with his laughter, became eerily quiet, every creak of the floorboards a painful reminder of his absence. It felt too big, too empty, and even as a child, I knew something had irrevocably shifted. Mom didn't cry for long, though. She threw herself into practicalities, and soon after, she met Richard at a community support group for widowed parents. Richard was nice enough, tall, with kind eyes and a gentle smile that reminded me of Dad in some vague, unnameable way. Within a year, they were married, and he moved into our house. Adjusting to having a new father figure was strange for me. I did not resent him, but he felt like an intruder in our fragile little family. Before I could fully get used to him, Mom dropped another bombshell. She was pregnant. Her face practically glowed as she announced it, her excitement spilling over as she told me I was going to be a big sister. I was 8 when Tommy was born, and from that point on, everything changed. Mom quit her job as an elementary school teacher to stay home with Tommy. "He needs me," she would say whenever anyone questioned her decision. "These early years are crucial for a child's development." I wanted to ask about my early years, if they had been crucial too, but the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I watched silently as Mom's world began to shrink until it revolved entirely around Tommy. She started forgetting things. Small things at first, like packing my lunch for school. At dinner, I would mention being hungry, and she would give me a distracted apology. "Oh, I'm sorry, sweetie," she would say, already turning back to Tommy. "I was just so busy with Tommy's doctor's appointment today." It was not a one-time thing. It became our new normal. Richard noticed too. I would catch him watching Mom with a worried frown as she fussed over Tommy, ignoring me entirely at the dinner table. One evening, as I sat alone doing my homework, Richard joined me, offering to help with my math problems. "You know, Lily," he said softly, his voice full of understanding, "sometimes people get so caught up in one thing that they forget to see what else they might be missing." As Tommy grew older, the tension in the house became impossible to ignore. Richard tried bringing up Mom's obsession with Tommy countless times, but the conversations always ended the same way, with Mom becoming defensive and angry. I remember one evening vividly. Tommy was about 5, pushing his food around his plate while Mom hovered over him, coaxing him to take just one more bite. "Sarah," Richard said, putting down his fork, his tone careful but firm, "we need to talk about this. You cannot keep hovering over him like this. He needs to learn to do things on his own." Mom's face hardened instantly. What are you trying to say, that I am a bad mother?" "That is not what I meant, and you know it," Richard replied, his voice steady. "But you have 2 kids here, not 1, and a husband too, by the way." I stared at my mashed potatoes, pretending to be engrossed in them, but I was hanging on every word. "Tommy needs me," Mom snapped. "He is still so young." I was young too, I muttered under my breath, but nobody seemed to hear me. The situation boiled over when Richard suggested enrolling Tommy in Little League Baseball. I was sitting on the stairs, supposedly doing my homework, when I overheard them arguing in the kitchen. "Absolutely not!" Mom's voice was shrill. "Do you know how dangerous baseball can be? He could get hit by the ball, twist his ankle, or—" "For God's sake, Sarah," Richard interrupted, his frustration evident. "He needs to experience life. You cannot protect him from everything." But Mom would not budge. Instead, she enrolled Tommy in art classes at the community center. I still remember Tommy's sullen face as he sat in those classes, dragging his brush mindlessly across paper while other kids actually tried to paint. He quit after 3 sessions, and Mom, of course, blamed the teacher for not understanding her son's creative spirit. The dynamic in our household only grew more strained, with Tommy at the center of it all. Richard tried to balance things by spending more time with me, cheering me on at karate classes, helping with school projects, and being the father figure I desperately needed. But Mom's fixation on Tommy remained unshaken, and the growing cracks in our family felt impossible to mend. I still remember Tommy's sullen face during those art classes Mom had insisted on. He sat there, barely putting in any effort, dragging his brush across the paper in a way that screamed boredom. Meanwhile, other kids were eagerly mixing colors, experimenting with shapes, and genuinely trying to learn something. After 3 sessions, he quit. Of course, Mom blamed the teacher. "They just do not understand his creative spirit," she said with a dismissive wave, as if the lack of engagement was everyone else's fault but Tommy's. I knew better than to argue. It was always easier to let her have the last word. While Tommy was being coddled into quitting yet another activity, Richard began spending more time with me. Maybe he saw through the imbalance in our family dynamic, or maybe he just saw a kid in need of a lifeline. Either way, I clung to the moments we shared. He took me to my karate classes 3 times a week, sitting through every session with unwavering enthusiasm. He cheered louder than anyone else when I earned a new belt, his pride unmistakable. Under his attention, I started to thrive. It was like I was finally being seen, finally being valued. Tommy, on the other hand, became increasingly difficult. His room was a perpetual disaster zone, clothes and toys scattered everywhere. It was not long before Mom started enlisting me as his personal maid. "Lily, be a dear and clean up Tommy's room," she would say, her tone more of a command than a request. The words made my stomach sink every time. It was not just the chore itself, but the implication behind it. Tommy could do no wrong. He did not have to learn responsibility because Mom would always have someone else pick up his slack, usually me. One day, Richard caught wind of this arrangement. I still remember the way his face hardened when he found out. "She is not his maid, Sarah," he said, his voice firm but not angry. "He needs to learn to clean up after himself." Mom's reaction was immediate and predictable. She burst into tears, playing her ultimate card, emotional manipulation. "I knew it," she cried, her voice thick with accusation. "You love her more than your own son. How can you treat Tommy this way?" I watched Richard's shoulders sag under the weight of her words. His face fell, and I saw the fight drain from his eyes. He looked at me apologetically before raising his hands in surrender. "Fine, have it your way," he said quietly, and walked away. From that moment on, Richard stopped arguing with Mom about Tommy, but the way he looked at me afterward told me everything I needed to know. He had not given up on me, even if he had given up on fighting with her. That small, silent reassurance became my comfort, my lifeline in a household where I often felt invisible. High school graduation day was a bittersweet milestone. Standing in my cap and gown, I scanned the crowd, my heart hoping for a moment of unity. Richard's beaming face stood out instantly, his pride shining like a beacon. Mom was there too, but her attention was elsewhere, her phone in hand. I could only imagine she was texting Tommy's babysitter to check on him. Even on what was supposed to be my day, Tommy's needs took center stage. Later that evening, Richard called me into his study. He pulled out a folder filled with college brochures and said, "I have been saving up, Lily. You can go wherever you want. Sky's the limit." Before I could even respond, Mom burst into the room. "You cannot be serious," she exclaimed, her voice sharp and incredulous. "That money should be saved for Tommy's future. He is going to need it more." Richard's expression hardened. I had seen that look before, the one he wore during every confrontation with her. "This is non-negotiable, Sarah. I have already made my decision," he said with quiet resolve. Mom stormed out, muttering under her breath, but the decision had been made. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was standing up for me. I chose Marshall University in West Virginia. It was far enough to give me the fresh start I desperately needed, but close enough that I could visit occasionally. When the day came to move into my dorm, Richard helped me carry my boxes up the stairs. Mom stayed behind, claiming she could not leave because Tommy had anxiety about her absence. As much as her excuse stung, it also confirmed what I already knew. College was exactly what I needed. For the first time, I felt free from the shadow of being the less favored child. I called home weekly, but most of my conversations were with Richard. Mom was always too busy with Tommy. Your brother is going through a difficult phase, Richard explained during one of our calls. His voice sounded weary, like he had been carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He is hanging out with these kids from the wrong side of the tracks. I tried getting him involved in some after-school programs, but your mother... His voice trailed off, and I finished the sentence for him. Let me guess. She said you were being too hard on him? Richard sighed heavily. Exactly. She called me a tyrant for suggesting he might need some structure. As Tommy's behavior worsened, my visits home became less frequent. On the rare occasions I did return, he barely acknowledged me. He spent his days holed up in his room, pale and angry, his eyes glued to video game screens. The contrast between our lives could not have been starker. While I was building my career at Deloitte in West Virginia, Tommy was sinking deeper into his self-imposed isolation, supported by Mom's endless stream of excuses. One visit, I knocked on his door, hoping to reconnect. Tommy, want to grab lunch? My treat, I offered. All I got in response was the sound of gunfire from his game. Mom, passing by in the hallway, just shrugged. He is not feeling social today. He is very stressed, you know, she said, as if that explained everything. Looking back, it was always the same pattern. Tommy's struggles were met with coddling and excuses, while my achievements were met with indifference. But by then, I had learned to stop expecting anything different. My focus was on building a life for myself, a life where I no longer had to live in the shadow of my brother or my mother's unrelenting favoritism. The contrast between our lives could not have been starker. I was climbing the corporate ladder, grinding through late nights and early mornings, pouring myself into a career I was proud of. Meanwhile, Tommy's life revolved around leveling up in video games and hanging out with his drinking buddies. Mom, of course, defended him at every turn, armed with an arsenal of excuses that ranged from, he is under a lot of stress, to, he just needs time to figure things out. Richard's face would tighten every time he heard these justifications, but by then, even he had largely given up on trying to intervene. It was exhausting to fight a battle when the opposition refused to see reason. By the time I turned 27, I had finally saved enough for a down payment on my own place. It was not a mansion or anything close, just a modest one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood. But it was mine. The day I got the keys felt like crossing a finish line after years of hard work. I could not stop smiling, thinking about all the sacrifices I had made to get there. Brown bagging lunches, skipping nights out, saying no to the allure of designer clothes. It had all been worth it.
You all have to come see it, I said during my weekly call home, the excitement bubbling in my voice. I'm having a housewarming party next Saturday. I'll cook dinner. Richard, I'm even making your favorite lasagna.
Richard's voice was warm and encouraging as always. Wouldn't miss it for the world, kiddo, he said. Then Mom's voice cut in. Oh, honey, I don't think we can make it, she said, her tone hesitant. Why not? I asked, already sensing the excuse coming. Well, Tommy has plans that day, she replied vaguely. Plans? I repeated, unable to keep the skepticism out of my voice. What kind of plans? Very important ones, she said, dodging the question. In the background, I could hear the unmistakable sounds of Tommy's video game blasting through the phone. I felt a familiar sting of disappointment, but swallowed it down. The day of the housewarming, Richard was the only one who showed up. He brought a potted plant and a bottle of wine, looking genuinely happy to be there. As we sat down for dinner, he said, "Your mother sends her love," but we both knew that was a lie. Over lasagna, he filled me in on what had been going on at home. Tommy, now 20, has not even bothered with college, Richard said, his voice laced with a mix of frustration and resignation. He spends his days either gaming or hanging out with his drinking buddies. I tried to help him, he continued, twirling his pasta with his fork. Offered him a position at my construction company, just as a starting point, you know? Everyone needs to start somewhere. He shook his head, his expression a mix of disbelief and sadness. But Sarah, your mother, said it would be beneath him. Can you believe that? She said our Tommy was too intelligent for manual labor. Too intelligent to work, but not too intelligent to mooch off his parents, I muttered bitterly. Richard gave me a sad smile. I keep trying, Lily. God knows I keep trying. That turned out to be the last real conversation we had. 2 years later, I got the call that changed everything. Richard had collapsed at work from a massive heart attack, just like my father. By the time I made it to the hospital, he was already gone. The funeral felt surreal, like a bad dream I could not wake up from. Mom put on quite the performance, sobbing dramatically and telling anyone who would listen what a wonderful husband Richard had been. We were so happy, she wailed. How will we manage without him? I watched her theatrics with a mix of disgust and pity. Her tears were not for Richard, they were for herself. I could see the wheels turning behind her grief-stricken facade. Without Richard's income, how would she maintain Tommy in the lifestyle to which he had become so accustomed? Tommy, of course, did not bother to dress appropriately for the occasion. He showed up in wrinkled khakis and a polo shirt that looked like it had been pulled from the bottom of his laundry pile. He spent most of the service glued to his phone while Mom made excuses for him. He is processing his grief in his own way, she said. Standing at Richard's grave, I could not help but think about how history had repeated itself. Another father figure, another heart attack, another funeral. Only this time I was old enough to see things clearly, to recognize that Mom's tears were more about her bank account than her broken heart. A year after Richard's death, I had mostly lost touch with Mom and Tommy. The little I knew came from Aunt Linda's occasional updates. They are getting by on Richard's savings, she told me during one of our rare phone calls. Your mom sold his Chevrolet last month. The tools from his workshop went before that. I tried not to care. I really did. But when Mom's number flashed on my phone one Tuesday evening, my heart still skipped a beat.
Lily, she said, her voice sounding smaller than I remembered, I need you to come home, please.
Something in her tone made me book a flight for the next day. But when I pulled up to our old house, I barely recognized the place. The once pristine lawn that Richard had meticulously maintained was now overgrown with weeds. Paint was peeling from the window frames, and one of the shutters hung crooked. The house looked as tired and neglected as the family inside it. The once pristine lawn that Richard had meticulously maintained now looked like it had been abandoned for years. Weeds sprouted everywhere, overtaking the flower beds he had planted with such care. The paint on the window frames was peeling away in large flakes, exposing the bare wood underneath, and one of the shutters hung precariously at an odd angle, as though it might fall off at any moment. It was a sight that filled me with an unsettling mix of sadness and resentment. Richard would have never let it get this bad. The house looked as if it had given up on itself, just like its occupants. When Mom opened the door, I was hit with a wave of musty air that carried the faint, sour tang of neglect. But that was not what made me stop in my tracks. It was Mom herself. The vibrant, polished woman I had grown up with, the one who would never leave the house without makeup or freshly styled hair, was gone. In her place stood someone who looked 20 years older than her actual age. Her face was lined with deep wrinkles, her shoulders slumped with fatigue, and her once impeccably colored hair now showed stark gray roots that spread like cracks in a foundation. "Come in," she said, her voice strained but still carrying a faint attempt at cheerfulness. She turned and shuffled toward the living room, leaving me to close the door behind her. Inside, the house was in no better shape than the lawn. Dishes were piled high in the sink, some of them crusted with food that looked like it had been sitting for days. A thin layer of dust coated every surface, muting the colors of the furniture and decor that had once made this place feel like home. I stared at the chaos, my mind involuntarily flashing back to how Mom used to make me rewash plates if she spotted a single water spot. This was unrecognizable. "Mom, what is going on?" I asked, lowering myself onto the couch. The moment I sat down, I regretted it. A sharp spring dug into my thigh, and I shifted uncomfortably, thinking about how Richard would have fixed that immediately. She did not answer right away. Instead, she sank into the armchair across from me, her hands twisting together in her lap. She looked small, almost fragile, but then the words came tumbling out. "We're running out of money, Lily," she said, her voice trembling. "My pension barely covers the utilities, and the savings, they are almost gone." I stared at her, my emotions swirling between pity and frustration. "What about Tommy?" I asked, trying to keep my tone even. "Is he helping with expenses?" Her face did this strange, complicated dance between embarrassment and defensiveness. "He is looking for work," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "It is not his fault, you know. These employers, they just do not understand him. The last place wanted him to start at 8 in the morning. You know Tommy is not a morning person. And the job before that, they expected him to do manual labor. With his intelligence?" I felt my jaw clench as I struggled to keep my composure. "Mom," I said slowly, "at his age and with no experience, he cannot exactly be picky about, You do not understand," she cut me off, her voice rising to that sharp pitch I remembered so well. It was her Tommy defense voice, the one she always used to shield him from criticism. Then, as if flipping a switch, her tone softened, taking on a pleading edge. "Lily, we need your help. We cannot survive without it. I hate to ask, but You are doing so well in your career." I knew what was coming, and I felt my stomach twist. Part of me wanted to refuse, to remind her of all the times she had chosen Tommy over me, all the years I had been the afterthought. But then I looked at her face worn and tired, her hands trembling with age and desperation, her eyes filled with a helplessness that I had never seen before. "How much do you need?" I asked, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. When she said $1,500 per month, I nearly choked. That was not just a little help. It was a significant chunk of my salary. It meant postponing my plans for a bigger apartment, for a newer car, for any semblance of financial freedom, but still I nodded. "Where is Tommy now?" I asked as I prepared to leave, already regretting my decision. "Oh, he is at a job interview," Mom said, her face brightening slightly. "A very promising position with a tech company." I glanced out the window and saw the faint glow of Tommy's bedroom light. The flicker of his computer screen was unmistakable. Some things never changed. True to my word, I set up an automatic transfer to Mom's account. Each month, as I watched that $1,500 leave my bank balance, I told myself it was the right thing to do. I told myself I was being the bigger person, the responsible one. But deep down, I knew I was just falling into the same old pattern, the one where Tommy came first and I was the backup plan. Tommy emerged from his room, his expression smug, as though he had just won a prize. "This is Candy," he announced with the confidence of someone who had accomplished something monumental. "My fiancé. She lives here now." Candy barely glanced up from her phone, the neon glow of the screen reflecting off her overly made-up face. With an audible pop of her gum, she went back to scrolling, her long acrylic nails tapping against the screen in a way that set my nerves on edge. As I stood there processing the audacity of the situation, she casually leaned over and rummaged through the grocery bag I had just brought in. Without so much as a thank you, she pulled out the premium cookies I had specifically bought for Mom and began eating them, crumbs falling onto the couch. "Nice to meet you too," I muttered under my breath, though I doubted she even heard me. Later that evening, when the initial shock had worn off, or at least dulled slightly, I called Mom to get some clarity. Surely this had to be some sort of misunderstanding. But the moment I heard her voice on the other end of the line, I knew better. "Oh, Lily!" she exclaimed, her voice brimming with enthusiasm. It was the most animated I had heard her in months. "Isn't it wonderful? Tommy is finally settling down. Candy has been such a good influence on him. He hasn't gone out drinking with those awful friends in weeks."
I resisted the urge to point out the empty imported beer bottles I had spotted in the recycling bin earlier. "Uh-huh," I mumbled noncommittally, trying to keep my frustration in check. "And he's even talking about getting a job," Mom continued, her voice rising with excitement. "Candy's cousin knows someone at a tech startup. Tommy says it could be his big break." Big break, right. I had lost count of how many big breaks Tommy had hyped up over the years, none of which had ever materialized into anything resembling actual work. Still, Mom sounded so hopeful, so desperate to believe in the fantasy she had constructed around her golden boy that I could not bring myself to burst her bubble. Instead, I made a few polite noises of agreement and changed the subject. My next visit home began like any other. I juggled grocery bags as I pushed open the front door, only to freeze in place at the sight before me. The house looked like a war zone. Dirty dishes were stacked precariously in the sink, greasy takeout containers littered every available surface, and clothes, both clean and dirty, were strewn across the living room floor. The air smelled faintly of old food and mildew. Candy was sprawled on the couch, her legs draped over the armrest, scrolling through her phone as though she did not have a care in the world. Her nails, freshly manicured in a garish shade of neon pink, gleamed in the dim light of the television. She did not even glance up as I set the groceries down on the cluttered kitchen counter. "You know," I said, my voice sharper than I intended, "you live here rent-free, eating food that I pay for. The least you could do is wash a dish or two." She looked up then, her lips curling into a smirk that made my stomach churn. "Who do you think you are to come in here giving orders?" she asked, her tone dripping with mockery. "This is not your house." "I grew up here," I shot back, my temper flaring. "You are just a guest." Her laugh was sharp and triumphant, the kind of sound that grated against your very soul. "Oh, honey," she said, drawing the word out like it was a joke only she was in on. "You have got it all wrong. This house belongs to Tommy now. Your mom signed everything over to him. There is a will and everything." The words hit me like a punch to the gut.
Unable to process what I had just heard, I stumbled into the kitchen, where I found Mom sitting at the table, meticulously organizing coupons she would never use. The sight of her calm demeanor only fueled my anger. "Is it true?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Did you make a will, leaving everything to Tommy?"
Mom did not meet my eyes at first, her fingers fidgeting with the edges of a coupon. Then she straightened her back and looked at me, her expression hardening. "Yes," she said flatly. "It is true." "I do not understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I am the one helping you. I am the one sending money every month. Tommy does not work. He does not contribute anything."
"Do not you dare talk about your brother that way," Mom snapped, her voice rising in anger. "You do not understand him. You never have."
"Understand what?" I asked, my voice breaking. "That he is a parasite? That he is perfectly content to live off my money while his girlfriend trashes our home?" "Oh, stop being so dramatic," Mom retorted, her face twisting into an expression I barely recognized. Then with a coldness that froze me to my core, she said, "You want to know the truth? I never loved you the way I love Tommy. He is better than you in every way that matters, and I do not want to see you here anymore." Her words hit like physical blows, each syllable stripping away years of denial and false hope. For so long, I had told myself that Mom loved me in her own way, that her favoritism was just a quirk, not a reflection of how she truly felt. But now, staring into her unflinching gaze, I knew better. I turned and walked out of the house, Candy's triumphant laughter echoing behind me. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with a whirlwind of emotions: anger, heartbreak, and, oddly enough, relief. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed onto the couch, my body numb but my mind painfully alert. As I stared at my phone, a thought struck me with startling clarity. Opening my banking app, I navigated to the automatic transfer to Mom's account, $1,500 every month for the past year. My finger hovered over the cancel button for only a moment before I clicked it decisively. My finger hovered over the screen for what felt like an eternity, the weight of years of guilt and obligation pressing down on me. But then, with a sharp intake of breath, I clicked Cancel Recurring Payment. It felt surreal, almost like I had cut an invisible thread that had been binding me to a part of my life I desperately needed to leave behind. For the first time in years, I had control. No more autopilot generosity, no more funding a dynamic where I was nothing more than a resource. For the next few weeks, I threw myself into work. I drowned in projects and deadlines, filling every moment to block out the lingering echoes of my mother's voice. Always demanding, always guilting. The hole in my budget, the one that had been draining $1,500 a month for years, started to feel less like a loss and more like an opportunity. I began researching investment options and ran countless spreadsheets. What if I could finally save enough for a real house? A place that was truly mine, a home that did not come with years of resentment embedded in its walls. The thought felt like a warm, distant light, something I could walk toward. Exactly 1 month after my last visit home, the inevitable happened. My phone buzzed with her name flashing across the screen. I debated ignoring it, but curiosity won. Her voice came through cold and sharp. "The money didn't come through," she said without so much as a greeting. No hello, no how are you, just straight to business. "There must be some mistake with the bank," she continued, her tone tinged with that practiced victimhood I knew so well. "There is no mistake," I replied, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "I canceled the transfers." The silence that followed was deafening, a chasm of shock I could practically feel through the phone. And then, as expected, the explosion. "You what? How dare you after everything I have done for you?" I let out a bitter laugh. It was the only response that felt appropriate. "Everything you have done for me? Like what, Mom? Forgetting I existed? Making me Tommy's maid? Telling me you never loved me as much as him?" My voice cracked slightly, but I powered through. "That is different," she snapped, defaulting to the defensive tone she always used when it came to Tommy. "You know I was upset when I said that, but you cannot just stop helping us. We are counting on that money. Tommy and Candy are planning a vacation to Cancun. They need a break." I could not hold back the anger anymore. "A vacation from what, Mom? Playing video games? Drinking beer? Tommy does not need a vacation, he needs a job." "How dare you speak about your brother that way?" she shot back, her voice rising. "You are just jealous because..." "Because what?" I interrupted. "Because you left everything to him? Because you enabled him to be a parasite while I worked my ass off to make something of myself? Fine. You made your choice, Mom.
Now Tommy can take care of you.
She started to sputter, launching into another tirade, but I'd heard it all before. The accusations, the manipulation, the endless guilt tripping. It was a broken record I no longer had the patience for.
Goodbye, Mom. Do not call me again, I said firmly, before hanging up and blocking her number.
But of course, she was not done. Over the next few weeks, the guilt campaign kicked into high gear. Facebook messages poured in, each one more dramatic than the last, detailing how she was barely scraping by and how ungrateful I was. Instagram comments called me a terrible daughter. Emails arrived in bulk, recounting all the supposed sacrifices she had made for me, most of which I knew were either exaggerated or outright fabricated. Then Tommy joined in, his texts dripping with entitlement and aggression. Mom's crying because of you, one message read. You better start sending money again, or else. I blocked him too, but not before replying with, here's a crazy idea, try getting a job. The most absurd part came when Candy reached out through LinkedIn of all places. Her message was long and full of melodrama about how I was breaking my poor mother's heart and how Tommy was too sensitive to handle the stress of work right now. I almost admired her audacity. Almost. It has been 6 months now. I have no idea how they are doing, and for the first time, I do not feel guilty about that. Maybe they have finally realized Tommy needs to support himself. Maybe they are still waiting for me to cave and start sending money again. Maybe they have found someone else to manipulate. The truth is, I do not care anymore. What I do know is that the $1,500 I used to send them every month has gone into a down payment fund for my own house. A house I will own outright. I know that I sleep better at night, no longer jolted awake by angry messages or guilt-tripping calls. I know that Richard would be proud of me for finally standing up for myself. The other day, I drove past a construction site and noticed a now hiring sign. For a fleeting moment, I thought about taking a picture and sending it to Tommy. But then I just laughed, shook my head, and kept driving. Their problems are not my problems anymore. After years of being tethered to their chaos, I am finally free, and it feels incredible.